The call lasted 47 seconds. I counted. 47 seconds to destroy everything my parents thought they knew about me. 47 seconds to say the words my lawyer had written on a sticky note and slid across the table like a confession. Mom, I lost it all. The business, the money, everything. She didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She said, "How much exactly?" And something inside me went very, very cold.
My name is Callie Rhodes. I'm 34 years old. And until 18 months ago, I genuinely believed my family loved me. Not in the complicated, conditional way you read about in therapy books. I mean the real kind. The kind where they show up, the kind where they ask how you're sleeping, not how much you're earning. I believed that for a long time. I was wrong. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the beginning. I grew up in a house that smelled like coffee and old wood. My father was a contractor. My mother taught piano to neighborhood kids on Tuesday afternoons. We weren't rich. We weren't struggling. We were comfortable in the quiet way that people don't appreciate until it's gone. I was the middle child. My older brother Dean was the golden one. Athletic, charming, the kind of person who walks into a room and everyone turns slightly toward him like sunflowers. My younger sister Petra was the baby. She got away with everything and she knew it. I was the invisible one. Not in a dramatic, tragic way. More like I was just there. Reliable, steady, the one who remembered everyone's birthdays and never asked for anything and got good grades because no one was particularly watching. I think that invisibility is what made me so driven. If no one was going to notice me, I was going to build something so impossible to ignore that they'd have no choice. I started my first small business at 22. A personalized gift company. Nothing glamorous. Custom photo books, engraved jewelry, that kind of thing. I ran it out of my apartment for 2 years, and then sold it for $40,000. To most people, that's a windfall. To me, it was a proof of concept. I reinvested. I learned. I made mistakes that cost me and lessons that shaped me. By 28, I had built a small digital services firm. By 31, it had grown into something real. 12 employees, consistent revenue, a reputation in my industry that I had earned entirely on my own. I never asked my family for money, not once. And the strange thing is, I don't think they ever fully understood what I did. My father used to introduce me at family gatherings as Callie. She does something with computers. My mother once asked if my company was like a typing service. I laughed it off. Every time I laughed it off. Because I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I wasn't building it for their approval. But if I'm being honest, and this whole story is about finally being honest, part of me was absolutely building it for them. The year I turned 33, I received an offer. A larger firm wanted to acquire my company, the number they put on. The table was the kind of number that makes your hands shake when you see it in an email. Significant, life-changing, the kind of financial outcome that only happens to other people, until it happens to you. I hired a lawyer named Graham. Graham was not what I expected. He was quiet, deliberate. He had the energy of someone who had seen every version of human behavior and found most of it predictable. He wore the same kind of dark blazer to every meeting, and he asked questions that felt slow at first and then later you realized had been remarkably precise. He reviewed everything, the offer, my company structure, my personal financials, and then he asked me something unexpected. Who knows about this acquisition? I listed a few people, a close friend, my accountant. Family? He asked. I mentioned it to my mom, casually. He wrote something down. Then he looked up and said, I want you to think carefully about what you share and with whom before this closes. Significant money changes relationships, not always, but often enough that I've made a habit of asking. I nodded. I thought he was being procedural. I didn't know he was already watching something I couldn't see yet. The acquisition took several months to finalize. During that time, something shifted in my family. It was subtle at first. My mother started calling more often, not long calls, just check-ins. How are things going with that deal, sweetheart? The way she said deal felt practiced, like she'd been rehearsing casualness. Dean suddenly became interested in my life. He texted me twice in 1 week, which was more than he'd done in the previous year. He mentioned very offhandedly that he'd been thinking about investing in a friend's business and was wondering if I had any thoughts. Petra asked to visit. She hadn't visited in 2 years. I felt warm about it. I am ashamed to admit that now, but I did. I thought the success was finally doing what I'd always secretly hoped. I thought it was drawing them in, reconnecting us, Graham saw it differently. At our next meeting, he slid a notepad across the table with a single question written on it. Have any family members asked you about your estate planning, your will, or your financial future? I stared at it. My dad asked if I'd thought about setting up a trust, I said slowly. I assumed it was just fatherly concern. Graham nodded once, not surprised, just confirming something. Callie, he said, I want to propose something, and I need you to trust me completely, because it's going to feel wrong at first. What Graham proposed was this. Before the acquisition closed, I would call my parents and tell them that the deal had fallen through, that I had made a serious financial mistake in the negotiations, one that had exposed me to liability, and that I had lost nearly everything. Not everything, but close. I would be specific enough to be believable, vague enough to be protected. Why? I asked. Because I need to know who they become, he said simply. When they believe you have nothing. I sat with that for a long moment. You think they're going to show their real intentions? I think, he said carefully, that the people who love you unconditionally will respond with concern. And the people who were circling the money will respond with something else. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that my family wasn't like that whatever interest they'd been showing lately was genuine. But I had grown up being the invisible daughter, and some part of me, buried and quiet, already suspected what the test might reveal. I made the call on a Thursday evening. 47 seconds. Mom, I lost it all. The business, the money, everything. How much exactly? I told my father the next morning. His response was 3 hours of silence followed by a text that said, "Call me when you're ready to talk about next steps." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "I'm so sorry." Next steps. Dean called that afternoon and spent 20 minutes explaining why this was actually my fault. I had been too aggressive, too risky. He'd always thought the business world wasn't suited to my personality type. He said this gently, like he was doing me a favor. Petra sent a voice message that lasted 40 seconds. She said she'd been thinking and maybe it was better for me to move back, home for a while. There was a spare room. She and my parents had discussed it. Before she even called me, I sat on my kitchen floor that night with my phone in my hands and I cried. Not because I was hurt, though I was, but because Graham had been right. And being right about something like that is its own particular kind of grief. There's a moment when you realize you've been loving a version of people that never fully existed. It doesn't arrive with drama. It arrives quietly, like a door closing somewhere at the back of your chest. Over the following 2 weeks, I watched my family's behavior with a clarity I'd never had before. My mother called 3 times. Each call circled back to the same question, dressed in different clothes. What did you do with the money you had saved? What happens to your assets now? Is there anything left in the business accounts? She was building a picture, trying to understand the landscape of what remained. My father had lunch with my uncle without telling me. I found out through a family friend. Apparently they discussed whether there was any way to formalize financial support arrangements, which would require me to provide documentation of my current assets. They weren't trying to help me. They were trying to inventory me. Dean called once more. This time he mentioned that he had spoken to a financial advisor, his financial advisor, who had thoughts about how to protect family assets in situations like mine. He could set up a meeting if I wanted. I said I'd think about it. Graham, when I told him all of this, simply opened his laptop and started typing. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Preparing," he said. The dinner invitation came on a Sunday. My mother called and said the whole family was getting together at their house on Wednesday evening, just to reconnect, just to be together. She used the word together 4 times in a 2-minute phone call. Graham told me to go. He told me to sit quietly, say very little, and observe everything. And if they asked me to sign something, I said. I was half joking. He didn't smile. Then you call me immediately and you sign nothing. I arrived at my parents' house at 6:30. The kitchen smelled the way it always had. That should have comforted me. Instead, it made everything feel more surreal. The way familiar things do when the context around them has changed completely. Dean was already there. Petra too. My uncle was sitting in the armchair he always claimed at family gatherings, holding a glass of water and looking at his phone. Nobody hugged me at the door. My mother kissed my cheek and took my jacket. My father looked up from the kitchen counter and nodded. We ate dinner. The conversation was careful, controlled, like everyone was waiting for the second act. It came over dessert. My father set down his fork, and the small sound of it against the plate felt deliberate, like a gavel. "Callie," he said, "we've been talking as a family, and we want to help you." I looked at him. "We've been in touch with someone who helps families manage situations like yours. When there's been a financial setback in there, our shared family assets to consider. Shared family assets. My grandmother had left me a sum of money when she passed. It wasn't enormous, but it was mine, left specifically to me, with my name on the documentation. We think it makes sense to consolidate," my father continued. "Pool the family resources. Create a unified structure that protects everyone." Petra nodded. She was watching me carefully. "And we've actually prepared some paperwork," my mother said. She reached under her chair. She had clearly placed it there before I arrived, and set a folder on the table. She pushed it toward me. I looked at the folder. I looked at my family. I looked at my uncle, who had put down his phone and was now watching with the patient attention of someone who has a stake in the outcome. And I felt, very clearly and very calmly, the specific weight of what was happening. They had planned this dinner. They had prepared documents. They had invited my uncle as a witness or a reinforcement. They had arranged all of this before I walked through the door, because they believed I was desperate, because they believed I needed them. I reached out and I touched the folder. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Graham. 2 words. "Don't sign." I stood up from the table. "I need a minute," I said. My mother reached for my arm. "Callie, it's really straightforward. It's just a simple—" "1 minute," I said again. I walked to the back hallway. The same hallway I'd walked down 1,000 times growing up. Past the framed school photos, past the watercolor my grandmother had painted that had hung there for as long as I could remember. I called Graham. He answered on the first ring. "Tell me what's in the folder," I said quietly. "I don't know exactly," he said, "but I can tell you what I suspect. And I need you to stay calm, because what I'm about to tell you changes the shape of this entire evening." My back was against the wall. I could hear my family's voices in the dining room, low and careful. "Tell me," I said. And he did. What made the situation unusual was how gradually everything unfolded. There was no single moment that clearly marked the beginning of the tension. Instead, it developed through a series of small, almost invisible changes. Conversations became shorter than they used to be. Certain details were left unexplained. At first, these things seemed insignificant. But over time, the pattern became difficult to ignore. People started paying closer attention to what was happening. Every action carried a meaning that hadn't existed before. Even ordinary decisions felt more deliberate and calculated. The atmosphere shifted from relaxed to quietly cautious. No one openly challenged the situation. Yet everyone sensed that something important had changed. That growing awareness slowly altered how people interacted. And once that awareness appeared, the dynamic could never return to what it had been before. Graham's voice was steady. That was the thing about him. Even when he was delivering information that should have made the walls shake, he spoke like someone reading a weather report. "The folder on that table," he said, "almost certainly contains a voluntary asset consolidation agreement. What that means in plain language is this: if you sign it, you transfer legal management of your grandmother's inheritance into a shared family trust, one that your parents control." I pressed my shoulder harder against the wall. "They'd have access to my money. Complete discretionary access," he said. "And because it would be framed as a family support structure, reversing it would be expensive, slow, and emotionally exhausting. Designed to be." "Graham." My voice came out smaller than I wanted. "How long have they been planning this?" A pause, not hesitation, just precision. "Based on what you've described over the past few weeks, I believe the conversation started shortly after your mother first heard about the acquisition, before you told them anything official. Someone talked." I closed my eyes. My accountant had mentioned it to his assistant. A small-town logic chain I'd never thought to worry about. Word had reached my mother through 2 degrees of connection and 3 weeks of patient waiting. They had known about the acquisition, and when I called to say I'd lost everything, they hadn't been surprised. They had pivoted, quickly and cleanly, like people who had already considered this possibility and had a backup plan ready. "What do I do?" I asked. "You go back to that table," Graham said. "You sit down. You do not sign anything. And you tell them you'd like your lawyer to review it first. They'll push back." "Yes," he agreed. "Let them." I walked back into the dining room. 7 eyes tracked me across the room as I sat down. My uncle had refilled his water glass. Petra was doing that thing she did when she was anxious, tapping her thumbnail against the table edge in a rhythm. She probably didn't notice. My father spoke first. "Everything okay?" "Fine," I said. I folded my hands in my lap. "I'd like to read through the documents before I do anything." My mother smiled the way people smile when they're managing you. "Of course, sweetheart. Take all the time you need. It's straightforward, really." I opened the folder. Graham had been right. The language was dense, but the architecture was simple. Once you knew what you were looking at. Voluntary consolidation, family trust, shared governance structure, my parents listed as primary trustees, my name listed as a beneficiary, not a trustee, a beneficiary, in my own grandmother's legacy. I turned a page, then another. Then I stopped at a clause near the back that was written, in the same font as everything else, deliberately unremarkable. In the event that a named beneficiary demonstrates financial instability is determined by the primary trustees, distribution may be suspended pending review. I read it twice. Financial instability, as determined by the primary trustees, which meant my parents could decide at any point that I was unstable. And freeze everything, indefinitely. It wasn't a support structure. It was a cage with a very comfortable-looking door. I closed the folder. "I need Graham to look at this," I said. My uncle set down his water glass. It was the first time he'd spoken all evening. "Your lawyer is going to complicate something that doesn't need to be complicated. Callie, this is a family matter." "Exactly," I said, "which is why I want to understand it fully." Dean leaned forward. His voice took on that gentle, patronizing quality he'd perfected over decades. "Look, nobody is trying to take anything from you. You're in a tough spot. We're trying to create a safety net by making Mom and Dad the trustees of my inheritance." Silence. "That's not," Petra started. "Petra." I looked at her directly. "I read the clause on page 7. She stopped tapping her thumbnail. My mother reached across the table and touched my hand. Her eyes had gone soft in a way that once would have undone me completely. "We're worried about you," she said. "After everything that happened, we just want you to be protected. And here is what I want you to understand about that moment." I had spent my entire life wanting her to say something like that. Wanting the worry. Wanting the protection. Wanting to matter enough to be held. She was saying all the right words. They were in service of completely the wrong thing. I slid my hand out from under hers. "I appreciate that," I said. "And Graham will review this and we'll talk." My father's expression shifted. The warmth dropped out of it like a stone through water. "Callie." His voice was quiet, but its edges were hard. "We've been very patient. The situation requires a decision. Tonight would be better for everyone." "Tonight isn't going to work," I said. And then my phone rang. I looked at the screen. "Graham, I need to take this," I said. I walked back to the hallway, but this time I left the dining room door open. Intentional. "Change of plans," Graham said. "I'm outside." I blinked. I had a feeling the evening might accelerate. "I'm parked across the street. I'd like to come in, if you're comfortable with that." I looked back toward the dining room, the murmur of my family rearranging their strategy. "Yes," I said. "Please." Graham walked through the front door 90 seconds later. He was wearing his dark blazer. He carried his briefcase. He looked exactly like what he was, someone who had done this before and was not remotely flustered. My family's reaction was immediate and physical. Chairs shifted. Postures changed. My uncle stood up, which he hadn't done for the entire evening. "What is this?" my father said. "Good evening." Graham set his briefcase on the empty end of the table, with the calm confidence of someone who had been invited. "I hope I'm not interrupting dinner." "You absolutely are," Dean said. "This is a private family." "I've asked him here," I said. My voice came out clear, steady, something I was quietly proud of. Graham sat down. He opened his briefcase. He removed a folder of his own, thicker than the one my mother had placed on the table, and set it down without opening it. "I've had the opportunity," he said pleasantly, "to review certain communications over the past several weeks. Financial inquiries, estate planning consultations, and some correspondence that involved Callie's assets rather directly, without her knowledge or participation." My mother's chin lifted. "I don't know what you think you've found, but I've found a pattern," Graham said. "A consistent, documented pattern of behavior that began approximately 9 weeks ago, When word of Callie's acquisition reached certain members of this family, my uncle took a step toward the door. "I'd stay," Graham said without looking at him. "What I have to share involves you specifically." My uncle stayed. What came out over the next 20 minutes was this. My uncle had been the architect. My parents the willing participants. Dean the secondary voice. Petra, and this was the part that surprised me most, Petra had actually raised concerns early on and been talked out of them. She had sent a text message to Dean 5 weeks ago that said simply, "This doesn't feel right." He had responded with 4 paragraphs, explaining why she was being emotional and naive. Graham laid it out without theatrics. Documents, timelines, emails that had been forwarded and replied to and forwarded again, building a paper trail that my uncle had apparently not considered permanent. The plan had been simple. Let Callie believe she had lost her financial foundation. Move quickly to consolidate her remaining assets, specifically her grandmother's inheritance, into a structure they controlled. Use the financial instability clause to maintain that control indefinitely. They had assumed I was too devastated and too desperate to read the fine print. They had assumed, perhaps, that I was still the invisible middle daughter who needed their approval more than she needed to protect herself. My mother started crying somewhere around minute 12. I want to be honest about how that felt, because the easy version of this story is that I watched her tears and felt nothing, that I had become iron. That's not true. I felt something, a deep, aching something that I suspect will never fully go away, because she was still my mother, because the kitchen still smelled like coffee and old wood, because I was still, somewhere underneath all of it, the child who had wanted to be seen by her. But I also understood, with a clarity that felt like finally exhaling after holding my breath for years, that her tears were not for me. They were for the plan. "What happens now?" my father asked. His voice had lost its authority. He just sounded tired. Graham looked at me. This was my moment. He had made that clear when we'd spoken earlier in the week. Whatever came next was my choice. I had thought about it for several days. I had considered anger, considered legal action, considered walking away completely and never returning. What I had landed on was something quieter. "Nothing criminal is going to happen," I said. "Graham has advised me that what was attempted exists in a complicated legal space, and I have no interest in dragging this family into a courtroom." My uncle exhaled. "However," I continued, "the inheritance my grandmother left me is going to remain entirely in my name, under my management, with no family involvement of any kind. That's not negotiable, and it's not a discussion." My father nodded once, a small defeated motion. "I'm also going to take some time away from this family. I don't know how long. I'm not saying it's permanent. I'm saying I need distance to understand whether any of this is repairable, and I need everyone in this room to give me that space without pressure, without contact initiated from your side, and without any further financial conversations of any kind." Petra looked up. Her eyes were red. "Callie," she said, "I want you to know that I know about your text to Dean," I said gently. "I know you had doubts. That matters to me. I just need time." She nodded. She looked younger than I'd seen her look in years. Graham and I walked out together into the night air. I stood on the front path for a moment and just breathed. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Honestly?" I looked up at the sky. Clear, wide, indifferent in the most comforting way. Like I've been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and I just put it down. "That's a reasonable response," he said. I laughed a little. "Graham, did you actually just happen to be parked outside? Or did you plan that entrance?" He allowed a very small smile. "I've learned that certain evenings have a tendency to require intervention. You could have just told me to leave." "I could have," he agreed. "But you needed to see it happen. You needed to watch the plan fall apart in the room where it was built. Otherwise, part of you would always wonder." He was right. He was almost always right, and I had learned to stop being surprised by it. The acquisition closed 6 weeks later. I won't give you a number. That's not the point of this story. The point is that I sat in Graham's conference room and signed the documents, and afterward I went home, and I made tea, and I sat by the window, and I felt, for the first time in as long as I could remember, entirely like myself. Not the invisible daughter, not the one who worked to be seen, not the one who measured her worth in other people's attention. Just me, in a quiet room, with a cup of tea, and a future that belonged entirely to me. Petra reached out 4 months later. A short message. No pressure, no agenda that I could detect. I've been thinking about you. I hope you're well. I'm sorry. Not as an excuse, just as a true thing. I read it 3 times. Then I wrote back, "Thank you. Give me a little more time. I think I'll get there." I haven't spoken to my parents since that evening. I don't know if I will. I hold that question loosely, without forcing an answer. Some doors close, some close and then, slowly, carefully, open again just a little. And some things that felt like endings turn out to be the first breath of something new. What I know is this. I built something from nothing. I protected it when the people I loved most tried to take it. And I walked out of that house with my grandmother's legacy intact, and my own integrity untouched. My grandmother had a saying she repeated so often it became wallpaper. I never really heard it until I needed to. The most important thing you'll ever own is your own name. Keep it clean. I kept mine clean. That's enough. As the situation finally settled, one thing became clear. Not every story ends with a perfect explanation. Sometimes the most important lessons appear only after everything is over. Moments that once seemed confusing begin to make sense with time. Looking back, every small detail had its place in the bigger picture. Every decision carried a consequence that slowly shaped the outcome. What once felt uncertain eventually turned into understanding, and that understanding changed the way everything was seen afterward. In the end, it wasn't just about what happened. It was about what was learned along the way. Because experiences like these rarely disappear without leaving something behind. They leave perspective, they leave awareness, and most importantly, they leave the wisdom to move forward differently.